Good afternoon. My name's Ann Olson, and I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of Last Stand. I'm here in Key West, while my colleague and fellow board member Dottie Moses is up in Key Largo, along with the Key Largo Federation of Homeowners and a number of folks from the Upper Keys. Plus, we have lots of folks joining us in Zoom. For those of you not familiar with Last Stand, we've been an active community advocate in the Florida Keys since 1987, preserving and protecting our quality of life and the natural environment. Our work at Last Stand wouldn't be possible without the long-term and generous support of folks like you. So if you place a value on your quality of life and the work that we do, please consider becoming a Last Stand member or a donor or a volunteer. There are QR codes here in the room at all these different flyers, or you can visit our website, keyslaststand.org, so we can keep these Keys conversations going. At Last Stand, we hear from many residents expressing their concerns about overdevelopment and how it's impacting their quality of life. Certainly, the more we develop, the more we all have to deal with issues like traffic congestion, just to name one issue, or one quality of life issue. Now, that's an annoyance on any given day, but it's also a public safety issue when there's a medical emergency or a hurricane approaching and we need to leave the Keys quickly. Decades ago, planners saw the need to limit growth for public safety, as well as for the protection of our nearshore water quality, our hardwood hammocks, endangered species, and because our infrastructure, even our drinking water, is limited. This is also known as our carrying capacity. To that end, those very smart planners created ways to measure things like our water quality and our ability to evacuate within 24 hours. Those measures were a way to let us know if we were exceeding our carrying capacity. And unfortunately, some of the indications are that we have exceeded that capacity. Our water pipe is failing, traffic studies are failing, water quality remains impaired, the reef is dying, and now so are the fish. So what should we do to get ourselves back on track? And that's what we hope to explore tonight. So this is a critical year for the Florida Keys. Every 10 years, based on new census data, Florida Commerce runs new hurricane evacuation modeling. The county and all the municipalities agreed last December to take this year to hold workshops, meet with stakeholders, and reach consensus in terms of the number of additional building allocations while balancing it against the risks of taking allocations. And thanks go to the county, who recently presented a special workshop explaining ROGOs, takings liability, and providing an initial estimate of potential buildable lots. The good news is that that horrifying number of just under 8,000 lots includes lots that cannot be developed. Some might be, the land might be submerged or wetlands protected or just doesn't meet required setback or density zoning. But the buildable number still came in over 3,000 countywide. We already exceeded the previously determined maximum build out for the Keys, and yet still received another 1,350 ROGOs in the last couple of years. So how will that play into our carrying capacity? And our speaker this evening might have some answers to that. Richard Grosso, a nationally renowned land development and environmental attorney, has been involved with Keys carrying capacity for decades. We so appreciated Richard's willingness to speak at our January annual meeting, along with water quality, hurricane, resiliency, and environmental experts. But people were clamoring to ask more questions of Richard, and so we're thrilled he's willing to meet with us here again. So after his presentation, Richard will take questions first from our audience here in Key West, then Key Largo, and then for the folks joining us via Zoom. So ladies and gentlemen, may I please present Richard Grosso.
Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. It's been a really excellent development to see Last Stand do so much work lately to rise to the occasion to meet the challenges that are currently facing the Florida Keys. I have been around them for a very long time, and from the beginning, really, when the whole modern era of land use planning in the Keys began. And so I thought what I would do here this afternoon, is talk to you all about the history of land use planning in the Keys, the origins of the current carrying capacity ROGO based planning for the Keys, and how that has progressed over the years, where that puts us today in terms of policy decision and facts on the ground, and then we can have a conversation about it. Let me see if I'm able to execute a move. Can you see my my handy dandy PowerPoint I've just put together? Is that a yes? I'm not hearing anything. Can you all hear me? All right. I hope we can figure out this glitch. Can you hear me?
Richard, we can hear you, but nothing's coming through on your screen. It just says
Okay.
started screen
All right.
sharing. There's no document. If everyone could stand by, we have lost Richard. We're going to bring him back.
Am I back? Great.
Yes, you're back. Yay.
Great. And can you see my screen now?
Yes, hooray.
All right. So to continue on. So the resulting plan, again, the carrying capacity plan, was found legally deficient again, and therefore we went to trial back in the late 90s, 1996, 97. And the result were the big findings by an administrative law judge after several week evidentiary trial that really are the basis for modern planning in the Keys. The administrative law judge found, and then the cabinet affirmed these findings, that the Keys are unique, both environmentally and geographically, related to evacuation limitations. The nearshore waters had already exceeded their ability to assimilate nutrient pollution without adverse ecosystem changes. The same was probably true of wetland habitats, the tropical hardwood hammock, and the amount of development allowed exceeded that which could be safely evacuated in 24 hours, which was the standard that state and federal emergency management experts had told the state and the local governments. So the state then required, it used its authority under the critical area designation to limit development at that which could be evacuated within 24 hours. It allocated that development a certain amount every year, and it tied a continuation of those new yearly allocations to substantial progress by the Keys local governments on all the key issues here. We had septics that needed to be converted to central sewer. We needed to buy a lot of land to keep it from being developed. We had to increase habitat protection. And part of that was that the progress required a carrying capacity study to be done that would then require additional changes to the Keys rate of growth, depending on what the carrying capacity study concluded. Since that time, Marathon and Islamorada then became their own municipalities. By state law, they had to adopt comprehensive plans that carried forward those same requirements. The carrying capacity study got done in 2002, and it found that the tropical hardwood hammock ecosystem had already lost so much of its landmass and had already experienced so much fragmentation, roads, individual lots, whatever, that no further loss or fragmentation should be allowed. Changes that got made as a result of that were some adjustments to habitat protection in the comprehensive plans, but the state did not further prohibit any additional loss or fragmentation. So we've continued to lose tropical hardwood hammocks in the Keys. We did make some adjustments. The Monroe County tier map system took all the hammock properties in the county and adjusted their ROGO points based on the quality of the habitat, so that the highest quality habitats had least amount of chances to get those relatively scarce ROGO allocations. We've made really good progress on converting septic tanks to central sewer, but we're not completely done with that yet. And effluent disposal in Marathon continues to be on a shallow well, although I think as a result of a recent settlement agreement that will be changing in the future. Land acquisition by the state and the federal government, state and the local governments had continued because when we enacted the rate of growth ordinance, when the cabinet limited growth, as I've described to you, it was clear. We all knew that the amount of development that was ever going to be able to be allowed based on evacuation limits and water quality limits and habitat protection, not to mention traffic and water and way of life, the amount of development was never going to approach the amount of undeveloped vacant lots. And so we knew that. And that raises the issue of private property rights, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But a key component of dealing with the private property rights issue was that the state and the local governments would buy a lot of land, would buy as much land as we could to take those development rights off the coffers, to provide a return on value to the landowners who were involved. Land acquisition in the Keys have always been a really high priority on the state's land acquisition list. In recent years, land acquisition has tapered off a bit. A lot of land acquisition has been done to buy land for affordable housing as opposed to ecosystem protection. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of buying environmentally sensitive land in the Keys. Evacuation and development. When we wrote I was part of a team of lawyers who worked on the Keys comprehensive plan in the early days through my work with 1,000 Friends of Florida and representing a lot of other environmental groups. And so much of the rewriting of the comprehensive plans, the legal challenges involved in that, resulted in a lot of negotiation. There were a lot of parties at the table, environmental organizations, the state, then called the Department of Community Affairs, all the cities, Monroe County, of course. There are a variety of working groups that got put together that had representatives of building industry and other, so that all the stakeholders were involved in those discussions. So, everyone came to consensus on a few basic points. One of them was that in order to limit growth to what the Keys could really handle, as opposed to just allowing all undeveloped land to build out, we were going to have to buy a lot of land. We were going to have to put in place a lot of sort of what I might call property rights stoppers or relief valves. A lot of provisions that encouraged the congregation of multiple lots into one, so that landowners who had multiple lots could at least get one, single-family house built on their multiple lots. And there were a lot of other concessions and negotiations that had to happen. And one of the key ones was, how do we determine exactly what that growth cap ought to be? Because as a result of the findings in the litigation and that the governor and cabinet adopted and ratified, it was clear that evacuation was an obvious, realistic limit on how much development could occur in the future in the Keys. It was also pretty well understood that the nearshore water quality and the existing nutrient impairment in the nearshores was a limitation on how much development you could have. And the same for habitat protection. We had all these findings that those environmental carrying capacity constraints had already been exceeded. But when you had to sit down and write a comprehensive plan and come up with a finite number, what's the limit on long-term and then, annual development that could happen in the Keys, how do you come up with a number? And so the decision was made that evacuation would be the number that was chosen. And it's a really important aspect of this that I think a lot of people have underplayed or decided not to remember over the years. that the evacuation number was chosen because of all of those other things, water quality, habitat loss, that kind of thing. Evacuation lends itself to a number. It's a more or less quantifiable phenomenon, whereas the health of the ecosystem, both nearshore waters, the reef, the habitats, tropical hardwood hammocks, et cetera, those follow from what you might call soft science that doesn't lend itself to these numerically objective, figures. And so it was determined that hurricane evacuation would be the surrogate figure that would be used because that was objectively verifiable and defensible. And so the important part of that is that, even if hurricane evacuation capacity could be increased and more development could be allowed by staying within the 24-hour evacuation limit that got put into these comprehensive plans and also enacted into state law, that still doesn't mean that it would be appropriate to increase the rate of growth, because remember that evacuation capacity number was also acting as a surrogate for the ecosystem and water quality growth limits. So we had a variety of actions and debates and a couple of lawsuits over the years about some of the details of that, like when the cabinet would determine that the Keys local governments had made adequate progress on their work plan on acquisition and transportation and water quality, et cetera. And environmental groups would strongly disagree with that. We had a couple of times where we had to have litigation over that. But the big starting to bring us to today's decisions event really happened in 2012 when pursuant to part of that work plan that I told you had to keep happening in order to allow continued rate of growth, all the Keys local governments participated in an evacuation working group run by the state, the Department of Economic Opportunity. And it determined, and that's not my word, that's a quote out of the rules there, that what would be the total build out capacity for the Keys that allowed them to stay within a 24-hour evacuation time. And it determined that number to be 3,500 plus permits over a 10-year period. And there, to be honest about it, there were a lot of highly questionable assumptions made there. A lot of folks who are advocates of stricter land use planning and stronger public safety thought that a lot of assumptions had been made in that determination that erred on the side of allowing more development as opposed to erring on the side of being more cautious and realistic in terms of the ability to evacuate. But nonetheless, that was the number that stayed and was chosen. So then you fast forward to 2019, and we were closing in on that day of reckoning where those 3,500 building permits were not yet run out, but close to running out over the next couple of years or so. And the city of Marathon asked the cabinet, and the cabinet agreed to just grant 1,300 new, what they deemed workforce affordable housing allocations. We already knew that the amount of development the comp plans already allowed put us at 24 hours. In fact, it came out during the legal challenge to this 1,300 ROGO decision that the state had actually miscalculated back in the day in 2012, and the amount of development it allowed was actually at 26-hour evacuation time, not 24 hours. So there wasn't any science, there wasn't any reanalysis, there wasn't any data that showed that those carrying capacity limits, be that water quality or habitat or certainly evacuation, that somehow those had gone away. The cabinet just voted to grant 1,300 permits. And we brought litigation on that. We were unsuccessful at the trial level because the administrative law judge agreed with the local governments that, well, if you just assumed that all those 1,300 new ROGO residents would leave early, then it won't add anything to the evacuation time. And on appeal, we were victorious. The court said, no, there's no such thing really as early evacuation. The statute requires you to limit growth based on how many residents you can get out in a 24-hour time. You're obviously already over that and you're adding more. So the appeals court ruled in our favor and found that that grant of those 1,300 ROGO allocations violated the state law limitation on only allowing so much growth that could be evacuated in 24 hours. That legal victory was fairly short-lived because, as in all things that are environmental policy, the legislature gets to make that policy, not the courts. The court decision was enforcing state law and said allowing 1,300 new ROGOs violated state law. The legislature said, okay, well, we're gonna change that state law, and they granted, as part of an affordable housing bill, they legislatively granted those 1,300 units anyway. So that brings us to where we are now. So those 1,300 units have been legislatively granted, and the Keys local governments are in the process of doing their, however they do it, quarterly or yearly ROGO allocations. And again, there's concern, thought, discussion that at some point those 1,300 ROGO allocations will also be all gone, and what's going to happen next. And so the Florida Department of Commerce last year did a reevaluation of that working of the evacuation capacity. I've talked to you about the one that got done in 2013, and so every 10 years is the idea that they'll redo that analysis. And in the fall of 2013, the department came up with a working group new study and said, we're already at 26 hours now. And based on different assumptions about the account Key West, the account mobile homes, a lot of other factors and assumptions they made, they come up with future development scenarios that would be well over 30 hours, depending on what kind of assumptions we made about evacuation capacity, who was evacuating, what homes, what residences got included, et cetera. There's no looming decisions today, but the department, the local governments, everybody knows that at some point in the relatively near future, even those 1,300 ROGOs are going to run out, and what do we do next? I make this important point here. The report kind of goes out of its way. The report by the Department of Commerce to the governor and cabinet goes out of its way to emphasize we're not making any recommendations. We're just giving you data and facts, and I'll come back to this, I think, is a concern in a few minutes. The department reports as part of that analysis that we've got somewhat under 8,000 total privately owned vacant properties throughout the Keys. Obviously, that's important because I think most folks who've analyzed these issues, be it evacuation and hurricane, habitat protection, water quality, quality of life, traffic, et cetera, I don't think there's too many people who honestly believe that you could allow anything near 8,000 new homes in the Keys if you intend to protect public safety and the water quality that's the basis for the economy in the Keys and quality of life and your ability to actually, get home from work at some sort of reasonable hour. And so, that number really becomes the focus of a lot of current and future policy debate. And here the department has identified that this is the number of market rate ROGO allocations that we still have left before there will be another day of reckoning when a cabinet decision has to be made about whether and how much
new development to be allowed in the Keys. So, that brings us to the looming decisions and a discussion about what Last Stand and other organizations and individuals who've worked on these issues feels ought to be the policy perspective that takes hold as we move forward with making decisions about the future of development in the Florida Keys. So the Department of Commerce sent that report to the cabinet. It dutifully accepted that report a month ago or so with no discussion, no decisions. It's just there to be used in any future decisions. Monroe County has taken an initiative, which I think is a really good initiative, an effort to begin holding workshops that involve the public to get input on what should our growth policy, amount of growth going forward look like. So, the key pressure points coming up are going to be future planned changes by the county, Key West, Marathon, Islamorada, et cetera, and then what the governor and cabinet decide to do on those, remembering that under the critical area program, the governor and cabinet can say, no, you're not getting that amount of development, or no, you're not getting it without doing these, that, and the other things. And of course, just like we saw last year, or 2022, the legislature, of course, the legislature wrote the critical area law, designated the Keys as critical areas. The legislature granted that 1,300 rogo exception to the 24-hour evacuation limit. The legislature, under our Florida Constitution, is the dominant policy-making body. It can make whatever decisions it wants about the future of development in the Keys. It could blow it all wide open, or it could limit it completely and say, we're going to buy up all undeveloped land, and it could make all sorts of decisions in between. And so, that brings us to what are the issues now? What are the key points and issues that need to be discussed in the beginning and soon to be coming to fruition discussions about how much development in the Keys? Hurricane evacuation, obviously. We already exceed the 24-hour limit. And remember that wasn't just some number picked out of the air. The 24-hour limit was based on an awful lot of study, an awful lot of analysis by National Hurricane Center and other experts, emergency management experts around the state included, that said, no, 24 hours is it. Once you exceed a 24-hour evacuation time, now you're playing with fire. Now you're really running a risk for public safety. And we know we're already at least 26 hours in the Keys right now. Nearshore water quality remains impaired. Credit is to be given to the local governments and the state of Florida. There was with a lot of federal funding that helped, but we have made an awful lot of progress converting septic tanks to modern wastewater infrastructure in the Keys. Nevertheless, water quality, according to the EPA and the Department of Environmental Protection in Florida, hadn't gotten all that much better. It still remains impaired for nutrients. I've always suspected, and I'm not a water quality expert, I'm not a chemist, but based on the reports that I've read, studies I've read, and experts I've spoken to, probably one of the big challenges with water quality is that stormwater, water coming off US 1 and all the paved roads, water coming off of pavement from commercial and residential development, is roughly 50% of the nutrient input into the Keys nearshore waters. And wastewater is about the other 50%, more or less. We've been able to do a lot to improve wastewater infrastructure, but there are just some basic landmass constraints to how much we can improve how we're cleaning up stormwater in the Keys. You don't have a lot of landmass, obviously. We don't have a lot of soil between the surface and the water. the ability to increase the capacity and the effectiveness of stormwater treatment areas is extremely limited in the Florida Keys. That's a problem. So stormwater quality, it doesn't appear has really improved a whole heck of a lot. And that's probably a big reason why we still have impaired nearshore waters. That is exacerbated substantially by sea level rise. So, as the sea level is rising, you've got your stormwater treatment areas that are going to be inundated more frequently, obviously, with rising seawater, which is going to compromise and has already begun to compromise their ability to clean nutrients before they get out into the waters. So that's a major landmass constraint on how much more development you can have while protecting, trying to improve the water quality in the Keys nearshore waters. Other issue, tropical hardwood hammock ecosystem. We've continued to lose a lot of acreage of tropical hardwood hammock through just clearing, paving it over, fragmenting it with new roads. Affordable housing, and I think folks that I've represented and worked with over the years in the Keys are very mindful of the affordable housing issue in the Keys. It's a real issue. It's not a made up issue. It affects working families in the Keys in a real way. It's a major consideration under Florida law on the question of how much development should happen in the Keys. And, a thing that our organizations have continued to press over the 30 years we've been dealing with this is you've got to focus on the other known mechanisms to improve the affordable housing problem before you just start adding more development and hoping that will result in more affordable housing. And one of them is vacation rentals. Most of the planners in the Keys that I've talked to that we've had testify in court have pointed out vacation rentals as a huge problem in the Keys. I mean, just above the basics that construction is more expensive in the Keys because everybody wants to live there, and you've got great competition for homes. Another essential that because you're at the end of the state of Florida, getting construction crews, getting materials down to the Keys is just more expensive. So there's all these basic underlying affordability problems. But then on top of that, when so much of the existing housing stock is being used for vacation rentals, obviously that's no longer then available price-wise to a working class family. And just to point that out is just one issue for a minute, how it is that the legislature has saddled the Keys local governments with the same prohibition and preemption on regulating vacation rentals as it's done for the rest of the state. I don't understand that. And so vacation rentals is a huge problem. Allowing the Keys local governments to prohibit or strictly limit them would go a long way to helping the affordable housing problem in the Keys. What are the other issues on that are going to come to the forefront, that are at the forefront of future growth discussions? Transportation efficiency. We have had continued annual reports about transportation capacity on US 1. They're horrible. Most of us didn't need reports to tell us that. It's not a good legend. It's legendary and a bad legend how horrible it is to get on US 1 and to do any appreciable amount of driving during early morning, late afternoon, weekend, whatever on US 1. And so that failing transportation grade is a problem. It isn't going away, just like the evacuation limit isn't really going away. You've got one road in, one road out. You've got, for most of the length of US 1 in the Keys, you've either got development right butt up against the road, and so you can't afford and you don't have the capacity to increase the size or the width of the road, add lanes. And for other stretches of US 1, you are running along mangroves or highly environmentally sensitive land. And so we just don't have a realistic capacity to increase the ability of US 1 to accommodate more traffic. And then the other infrastructure problems we have, right? The FKAA pipes busting, fresh water supply, water lines, roads, bridges. If we weren't talking about new development at all, we were talking about just existing development in the Keys, we're looking at multi-billion-dollar repairs needed just to keep the existing freshwater supply, sewer lines, roads, bridges, up to snuff to handle the current load of impacts. And then you add sea level rise to all of that. And, Monroe County's done a lot of analysis of this, and they are looking at just exorbitant. There's no way we're ever going to get that kind of money, price tags, to elevate the existing roads, to keep the roads for existing development and existing subdivisions dry enough for people to live their lives. And so you've got a finite amount of land. You've got less of that land pretty much every day because of sea level rise, existing capacity limitations, environmental and infrastructure limits that aren't going away, that are only going to get worse. And so, on one hand, you'd say, because of this sea level rise, multi-billion-dollar costs of all this new infrastructure, public safety problem. We're already at an unsafe evacuation. You add one more residence, you're adding to that unsafe evacuation time. Ecosystem losses and degradation that threaten the economy and way of life that, people have made their life to enjoy in the Keys. So, on one hand, you'd say, well, that's an easy call. Then the answer has to be, we can't have any more development in the Keys. But of course, you've got these other major realistic policy and legal challenges. There's affordable housing needs that are real. You've got stakeholders that want more development for reasons other than affordable housing. And then, of course, you've got constitutional and state level private property rights. So that brings us to the discussion about what would we think should be the correct approach to those new decisions. And I want to use as the basis for that discussion a recent letter that I wrote on behalf of Florida Key Citizens Coalition, Last Stand, and the Island Key Largo Federation Homeowners Associations to the Governor and Cabinet, anticipating these looming policy decisions. We put down in writing the basic tenets of what we thought should guide future decisions as they're fixing to come up about development in the Florida Keys. Can I ask, are you able to see this letter that I'm sharing with you now? Can you all hear me?
We see you and we hear you.
Wonderful. Okay, so here's the letter that we wrote that lays out the key aspects of what we think ought to guide future decisions. Obviously, number one, we didn't just make up some arbitrary need to base growth decisions on carrying capacity limitations. These are very real, very important evacuation, environmental, physical carrying capacity limits. They have served us well. They were necessary to save lives. They were necessary to save the basis of the Keys ecosystem and economy. And we need to keep development limited and based on the carrying capacity limitations. The next key point And again, before I move away from that, those limitations include things like schools and potable water supplies. These are expensive. And when you don't have enough money to adequately serve the existing development, you got to be really careful on the amount of new development you allow. And with every growth choice to allow any new incremental increase in growth, there needs to be a price tag analyzed and attached to that. There needs to be a realistic assessment of how much it's going to cost to provide all the necessary facilities and services for that amount of new development. Because at some level, buying that land is cheaper than allowing it to develop and then having to serve it with facilities and services. It's cheaper from just the raw dollars and cents point before you even consider the economic value of preserving that land for ecosystem protection, water quality, health, et cetera, and the resulting economic impact on dive shops and fishermen and commercial industries that are based on the Keys ecosystem. The second tenet is going to be protection of existing residents and investments as the priority over requiring existing taxpayers to subsidize new development. I mean, it's just a reality of development, in particular residential development in the state, that every new home is subsidized to some extent by existing taxpayers. Impact fees don't pay 100% of the costs of all impacts from new development. And that's not all that well known by people, but it is the reality of any economic modern assessments of that have been done. The next tenet would be, we only should be allowing an increase in development as needed to avoid violating property rights. And that which is allowed, you need to prioritize true affordable housing over market rate. For example, over the 30 years or so that we've had the rate of growth ordinance, the bulk, the majority, the lion's share of new development allocations were for market rate. And less than half, in many cases only 20%, were allocated to affordable housing. Well, I mean, that needs to be reversed. We don't have a problem with expensive housing being available in the Keys. We have an affordable housing problem in the Keys. So if we're going to threaten public safety, if we're going to threaten continued impacts, adverse impacts to the ecosystem, it needs to be for a darn good reason. And that is affordable housing. It's not second and third homes for people, just to be, real blunt about it. And so that's it. Affordable housing and private property rights, those need to be the basis for any increase in development. And now on that, a huge elephant in the room is the private property rights issue. And a key premise of our arguments, a key point of analysis and legal research and argument I've done personally as a property rights lawyer when I used to work for the state, and work I've done, ever since then. And I would point out that Monroe County's very excellent land use lawyer, Derek Howard, has done analysis of the property rights issues, and I think he comes to pretty much the same conclusion, that we should not be assuming that every undeveloped lot in the Florida Keys has a property right to develop out. There are a lot of defenses available and mechanisms available to the Keys, local governments, and the state when it comes time to private property rights. We're talking about things like lot combination requirements. You own 5 lots, require you to combine them into one, and you get that one really nice house on those 5 lots. The United States Supreme Court has upheld decisions like that. You've got things like notice of the regulations that exist when you bought. An analysis had been done for us a few years ago, maybe about 3 years ago, by a talented woman named Jan Diamondstone, and this analysis seems to be bolstered by some subsequent work that the vast majority of lot purchases in the Keys have been done since the adoption of the strict growth limits in the Florida Keys. And the law is really clear on private property rights that when you purchase land that you know is subject to strict development, growth, et cetera, limits, then you know that, and you're taking your chances with that decision to purchase that lot. And it's going to be really hard for you to claim later that the state, the taxpayers need to compensate you for the resulting inability to build on that lot. And that buying with knowledge of strict limitations defense to takings claims is a really important one when it comes to ROGO and the Florida Keys. The other part of that, the other strong defense is that the stronger the governmental interest, the less likely a court will say strict regulation violates property rights. You don't have a stronger governmental interest anywhere than public safety, emergency management, safe hurricane evacuation. The basis for the strict growth limits in the Keys is itself a really strong defense to takings cases. But yet, there's going to be new development in the Keys. And again, affordable housing and property rights should be the only reason to allow that number. And then, like we had done, increased annual allocations for development in the Keys ought to be tied to finishing tasks that still need to be done. Complete deep well injection in Marathon, complete the acquisition of all medium or high quality tropical hardwood hammocks in the Florida Keys, the variety of other issues that development impacts, again, tie any increases to completion of tasks related to those issues: land acquisition, wastewater, elevating, roads, fixing the FKAA line, that kind of thing. And the next point would be affordable housing remedies other than just adding to ROGO. There's been so much, I talked about vacation rentals, but we've had so many affordable housing studies in the Keys over the years that have talked about things like the need to directly subsidize the purchaser or the renter as opposed to just building more. There's so many other things. Frankly, it's just been cheaper and easier for the state just to increase development than to come up with money, funding needed to help buy the land and help people get into homes and that kind of thing. Quality of life for residents should also be an emphasis here. We've talked a lot about sort of the quantifiable things, but you've got things like the right to farm laws being abused in the Keys. People claiming right to farm protections to keep the county from enforcing hammock clearing rules against them. The wedding and special event venue problem that is causing a lot of neighbors to lose sleep and lose quality of life in their residential neighborhoods that for now, all intents and purposes are now, hotel districts, those kinds of things. And the last point that I'll make here would be, we've got to find a way to let visitors do more than their fair share here of contributing financially to the costs. I've talked about a toll on US 1 or Cardstown Road. There are some potential constitutional issues with that. It would obviously require some federal legislation. Those are valid issues, but the need for tourism to make sure it's paying its way requires us to maximize the analysis and how much we can do when it comes to a toll road. The final point I want to make is an overarching governance decision, and then we'll open it up for discussion. A concern that I have right now is that I am seeing what I think are very troubling signs out of the state, the Department of Commerce. We talked about the critical area designation and the importance of the state having this oversight and final say on development in the Keys. I am getting a sense from things that the department has been writing and saying in the last year or so that they are looking to maybe get out of that business. They are looking to not make recommendations to the cabinet on what makes sense for future growth and development of the Keys. They are seemingly no longer enthused about playing that state oversight role that has been so crucial to planning for the Keys and necessary over the years. I'm hoping I'm wrong about that, and I'm hoping that the current state administration will see the need to have a very strong continued state role in terms of recommending growth policy to the cabinet and implementing that, and not just letting whatever will happen. So those are the things that I think should be guiding principles for the future of development in the Keys. Thanks for listening, and sorry for my technical glitches, but I'd be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Richard, and I'm sure we have some questions. We'll start with this room.
Thank you for this presentation. I thought it was really good. I'm Chris Massicott. I'm actually running for County Commissioner in District 3. But I want you briefly alluded to Derek Howard's presentation on takings cases. And I really worry about how a lot of the politicians in the county and at the municipal level, Marathon especially, are using potential takings cases as a scare tactic to kind of sway public opinion for more development, saying you're going to pay for this, it's only going to increase your burden if we don't do this. What can we do to kind of like educate people and get what Derek's presentation out there more to really educate people, saying this is not really a problem as large as a lot of these politicians are saying they are?
Yeah, great question. I'd love to see the media pick up on this and talk about it. I know, I really appreciate the process the county has started with having this discussion, because the law is really clear that there's not this broad brush approach to property rights. It's case by case basis based on all of these different factors. And we need to be really clear about pressing that message that the law is a lot more nuanced and complex than a lot of folks have always thought it was. And, in people's defense, property rights takings law is a complex, specialized area of law. And unless you're a, law geek like me or Derek Howard, you're probably not going to be all that well versed in it. So it's an easy, theme to just seize upon. But the other key message there is that most takings claims ever brought and decided by appeals courts, federal or state, have lost. And the case law is really clear that they're hard to win. Government has strong defenses, and it needs to be an extraordinary situation for a court to force existing taxpayers to compensate a landowner. It's only when the quote, I'm quoting out of the cases, justness and fairness require compensation. And that's not something you can just, reduce to some sort of rhetorical, if you don't let them build, you got to buy it. That's just not accurate, and we need to stay on that message.
Hello, Richard.
Hi.
So I'm Ed Russo, and I'm not running for anything, but I am president of Florida Keys Environmental Coalition. I'm on the board of Brief Relief. I was a former member of the Monroe County Climate Change Advisory Committee, and I serve as a member of the city's planning board. My question to you is, what impact do you think the Live Local law that has just been approved, what do you think that is, which preempts a lot of our local authority, how do you think that will affect the land use laws in a place like Key West? Thank you. Yeah, the Live Local law really, maybe, Richard, would you take care of that?
Yeah, there might be some parts of the live local law that I need to look at a little bit closer in terms of their applicability to the keys. It really applies to future land use map amendments. In general, it's a horrible piece of legislation. It's an example of a sledgehammer approach to an issue that required, a scalpel-like surgical approach to issues. It's really taken away a lot of the authority of local governments to make smart land use decisions. In the Florida Keys, the issues are a lot more ROGO allocations based on what you're already allowed in terms of a density under your future land use designations, as opposed to there being a lot of potential changes to future land use map designations. So its impact might be limited relative to the keys. While I'm waiting, I saw my friend George Garrett corrected me on something in the chat. The legislation was done, what did he tell me, in 2022? Not in the legislation that adopted the ROGOs 1300 was 2023, not 2022. Thanks, George.
It's Robert Spotswood in Key West. It's good to see you again. I haven't seen you in a It's great to see you. In fact, my daughter Mary is here. My son was here earlier, and both of them said to say hi to you as well.
Thank you. That's great. Tell them I said hi. They're great.
Yeah, I'll do it. So I agree with the fellow that's running for the county commission that we shouldn't overemphasize the takings liability, but on the other hand, we shouldn't underemphasize it as well, because it is real. If there are 8,000 lots out there approximately, even if we only say 2,000 or 3,000 would have valid claims, that could amount to $500 million to $1 billion in exposure to the county, which is not a small number. And what Derek Howard said that was very, very smart is, so long as you have the ROGOs available, they don't have to be given today, but you need to have the ROGOs and the entitlements to manage the problem. You could manage that problem over a long period of time. You could manage that problem over 50 years or 100 years or more. So it doesn't mean that you would develop 8,000 units or 3,000 units. You could develop 10 a year, but so long as you have that tool available to you, you have an absolute way to manage and defend against that potential exposure. So I think it's important, as you're going through the conversation, not to take too extreme of a position either way. You need the tools of having the entitlements available that could be subject to all the things you talked about. And I thought that all the points that you made in your presentation are valid. The only thing that's missing from the conversation, I think, that we should be thinking about is our permanent community is under threat. Less than 20% of the homes in Key West are presently homesteaded and permanently occupied. Less than 60%, maybe less than 50% in the county are permanently occupied. And so as we go through this, we should not only think about a way to defend against and offset a liability that we don't need to take on. We can save the $500 million. We can save the $1 billion and spend it in a much better way. But every single additional allocation we get from the state should either be for affordable workforce housing or for permanent residents of the Florida Keys. It shouldn't be for seasonal residents. It shouldn't be for vacation rentals or transient rooms. We need to build our permanent population to really keep the fabric of our community. And this community has expanded. It's not just Key West now, it's Key West and the entire Florida Keys. And we need to look at this as a total community. And if we don't have generational families that are staying here, 50 years from now, and I like to think about Key West 50 years from now, I like to think about my kids and my grandkids and what they're going to have as a community, which I've lived in for 6 generations of my family and 8 generations with my grandkids. So I'd like to think that 100 years from now, we're still going to have a real community here with families that live here from generation to generation. And so every single unit that's available to us, I would use to first make sure we don't have the takings liability, but then make sure we use those and get our local governments to tell us how they plan to protect our community long-term, and to use those allocations, if any, that are given to us to help us build and sustain our community, a permanent housing stock here, and not have it occupied part-time or rented on a transient basis. And so I think that's the part of the conversation that's missing from the letter, and the conversation I'm hearing is, how can we take this and turn it into a positive and use these additional ROGOs to our benefit to protect our community in the long term? Richard, it's great to see you, and thank you so much.
Robert, it is great to see you. Those are incredibly thoughtful ideas and comments. I know many and am related to many long-time Key Westers and Konks and other folks who lived in the Keys. I understand what you're talking about. The Keys should emphasize exactly what you talked about in terms of for whom are we building new development, and your point about Derek Howard's remarks and legal opinion, that the more we can mete out slowly with the remaining growth allocation and keep that potential of availability of future permits out there is a very strong, good approach to private property rights. And frankly, you know, the limited rate of growth and strategy had a lot to do with giving ourselves more time to buy land, to update and increase infrastructure and fix some of these problems that additional development is either creating or exacerbating. I really appreciated your comments. You were very, very thoughtful, my friend. Thank you. Glad you were here.
Thank you. And let's now go to Key Largo. See if, I know we have some questions coming in through the Q&A, so we're getting to you shortly, but checking in with Key Largo.
Bonnie Moses, I'm here in Key Largo representing with our Federation Group and the Upper Keys. So I'm going to have our first question.
Richard, thank you. I'm Richard Barretto, President of Tavernier Community Association. On your earlier slide, you indicated that there was, when you talked about how many ROGOs were left, there was 144 left in the administrative pool. That was originally 300. What happened to the 156 other ones? Do you know?
I'm assuming they've been granted,
No.
but I haven't looked at that. I was taking the local government's numbers there.
Administrative pool is fine. Okay, well, maybe I'm mistaken. I thought that you said there was so many other ROGOs, and then you said there was 144 left in the administrative pool. I thought you said in that slide.
Well, let me
I was mistaken.
see. Yeah. This is from the state.
From the original 1,300, the county got 300, and they put limitations on them to put them in an administrative pool
That's a different pool.
to be used for takings cases and all.
Yes.
But those are still.
Anyway, I think that was a very thoughtful and reasonable approach by the county, actually.
Yeah, I just wondered, all 300 of those still remain, or is it down to 144?
I think it's down to the 154, I believe is the number. 144, I believe is the number that the state reported.
Okay, so then we have used 156.
No. I'm getting some comments from staff, and they're telling me that that the 300 early evacuation ROGOs are in one pool, and the ones that you mentioned are non-early evacuation administrative
Okay.
relief. So
Okay.
combination of 444 administrative relief. Sorry.
I appreciate that, and I would defer to their numbers for sure, and I appreciate them
Yeah.
helping out.
One other question I just read recently this week, the Supreme Court ruled on a takings case out of California. I wondered how that's going to affect the Keys. They ruled in the favor of the homeowner. It was a property rights case. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
Are you talking about the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yes, U.S. Supreme Court.
Decision on the Sackett case, perhaps?
Lake Tahoe.
It was a case out of
Lake Tahoe.
Lake Tahoe. It had to do with mitigation fees. The county was charging someone to develop their land, and the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot impose you can't take those kind of property rights away from an owner, and it ruled in favor. I'm just wondering how that affects our takings cases in the Keys, if you know, or if you've even seen the case.
The rulings there have always been about, you can't, because of property rights, you cannot require a developer to pay an amount of money to develop $1 more than for what it costs you, the government, the taxpayers, to serve that development. And so that's been the issue always. And so as long as the Keys local governments, as they might be required or allowed by the state, are requiring impact fees or dedications of land or money only as calculated to meet the demands of that particular development application, that's legal. Because the other side of that coin is the U.S. Supreme Court has said no landowner has a property right to be subsidized at all by existing developers. So you're allowed to rationally apportion costs to a developer to make sure that they're paying for every dime of their impact to the public. And I don't think we're anywhere near running afoul of that.
Okay.
You know, in the court or in the Keys.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Richard, boy, we've been talking about this stuff for a very long time, my friend. But we're now to the point where the public, the taxpayers, have a hell of a lot more valid, factual complaints to register with the development community. Some of the stuff you mentioned, we still mention, and you and I have discussed this. This is time to get seriously quantifiable about some of these things, like the pipeline. The Aqueduct Authority has publicly said it's going to take them 15 to 20 years and cost upwards of $2 billion to replace the pipeline. So we're not going to have enough water for a long time, for a couple of decades. And yet, why do we compromise the water supply for the existing folks that already live here and pay that kind of money? The Aqueduct Authority, you and I discussed recently, built a $1 billion sewage treatment plant in the Lower Keys, and within the first couple of years, it's documented to have leaked more than 200,000 gallons of untreated sewage into the coastal environment of the Florida Keys. These are real numbers, and we should insist that the politicians deal with those real numbers. And we started doing that in the Citizens Coalition talks that we have, and you and I have talked about this many times, and you've started putting a lot of that in that. We need to encourage the taxpayers, the folks that do live here and are homesteaded here, to insist that the politicians use the realistic numbers of these things. The traffic, my God. And yet, the county has refused to adopt the last couple of traffic studies because they say we're over capacity and we should stop. So the taxpayers need to be insistent, or this expensive subsidy, which, as you just pointed out, the taxpayers aren't required to subsidize new development, only to maintain the infrastructure that they already have. Say that again. It sounds sweet when you say it.
Hi, this is Melissa Tomei. Nice to meet you. I really appreciate the presentation. I learned a lot, but I was wondering, you said that the hurricane evacuation was based on modeling. Is there any way to, like you said, figure out what they actually incorporated into that modeling, what they didn't? For example, during a September, like if, Irma came during Labor Day weekend, and so they may project like, oh, well, some of these people don't live here year round, but if it's Labor Day weekend, we're at almost full capacity. So in that case, what is actually based on? Is there a way to, as citizens, have some kind of liability claim that they're putting our lives at risk for approving certain things in the future?
Okay. Sure. There's two questions. Yeah, the study and all of its attachments is publicly available. I'm sure Last Stand could share the link to where you can get that. I've got a copy. Sure, I could email it to anybody, and you can, they show their math, they show all of their assumptions and that sort of thing. On your last question, I think in all honesty, as a lawyer, you can bring challenges to development decisions as those kinds of decisions can be challenged under state law. What you can't do is probably what I think you had in mind, which was, hey, your policy decision to allow that amount of development is endangering my life or otherwise having this bad impact on me because under the Constitution, government is given the right to make those kinds of policy decisions, and government can't be sued when its policy decisions just turn out bad. The basic constitutional stricture is that we're courts. It's government that gets elected to make these kinds of policy decisions, and we can't have elected officials all tied up in knots because they think they might get sued if a policy decision goes the wrong way. So you can't do that, but you certainly can enforce state law requirements for 24-hour evacuation times and adequate water quality and all of those other, corresponding issues. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't think anybody else has come up to ask a question, so I guess P. Largo, is satisfied.
Hi, Dottie. Let me just say,
Hi.
Dottie, you have done so much work over the years, and I say this about Ann Olson too. You two have done so much of incredible volunteer, high-level, talented work on behalf of people who care about protecting the Keys that I wanted to publicly acknowledge that. Just high-quality work, always reasonable, always thoughtful, always well-researched. You and both, that I'm really honored to work with you on public forums.
Thank you so much for supporting us in our efforts too. Thank you.
And I can see that we have a number of questions that have come in online, and because there's a lot of them, I'm going to try to summarize a couple of them. First question up was, just for simplicity, I'm going to say the traffic study that was done in 2023, the fact that failed, doesn't that control growth? Isn't that also limited by the traffic study?
I think if the question is the traffic study something that should control growth? Yes, it is. It's a little more complicated than that simple answer in terms of the ability of the local government to prohibit approval of a new development permit because the roads are already over capacity. There's some allowances in state law for that. We don't have strict or as strict transportation concurrency as we used to have, because we kind of backed off of that when it became clear that we weren't doing a very good job of maintaining our roadway capacity. So it's a complicated question and pretty nuanced in terms of the ability to truly enforce that inadequate roadway capacity against any new development approvals. I could do an hour-long seminar on that, but that's a short answer.
Another question is related to the fact that the Memorandum of Understanding governing evacuation studies hasn't been meaningfully updated since 2012. And certainly a lot has changed. There's a lot more non-resident homes that are, and I'm going to have a hard time summarizing this, but occupied or not. I know the standards they use is the homeowner resident on April 1st. In years past, if you weren't here, they assumed you were a snowbird and you weren't there. Now we have vacation rentals in those same homes. let's see, and that's what they just commented on, the amount of background traffic, the huge growth in the South Dade, Miami-Dade area at the end of the evacuation modeling, because it takes us to Florida City and not beyond, and doesn't consider other regional effects. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that further. Richard.
Oh, me? Right. One of the concerns and criticisms that have been, levied against the evacuation study over the years is that it calls an evacuation over when Keys evacuees get to Florida City. And it assumes that there would be no evacuating Dade County cars to meet all these Keys evacuees. So that's obviously not realistic. If the Keys are evacuating, probably South Dade is evacuating too. But the way they've run the models is they just assume that there's clear sailing for the Keys evacuees once they get essentially, to the mainland. And so the criticism has been, look, at that point, whether it's 24 hours or 26, you're not exactly sitting in a safe shelter somewhere. You're not exactly in high and dry land. You're on a car on US 1 that's probably congested with traffic from South Dade evacuees. And so, yeah, that's one of those assumptions that I mentioned earlier that has been criticized as giving the benefit of the doubt towards allowing more development as opposed to being safer. I think it's a valid point.
There's another question regarding Richard's presentation, and we'll certainly share all the information, materials, and video on the keyslaststandwebsite.org in the next day or two. One other question is, does the issue of development in an area of state critical concern with the compounding impacts of sea level rise make a compelling case for a state-funded buyout program? Has there been any discussion or consideration of funding to support this type of program?
Well, I think the short answer to that is yes. That's not necessarily a new policy or position. The Keys have been for decades a priority acquisition target for the state program. I don't think that in very recent times there's been a direct conversation with the governor and cabinet about, okay, here's where we stand. There's X amount of value of undeveloped land in the Keys. We think realistically we can only allow X amount to be developed. Here's the dollar figure. Can we get the legislature to allocate X, Y, and Z to help us buy all or most of that land? That's probably a discussion that very much should be happening right now. And during this lull in the action, I want to make a point. I've been working Keys land use issues since the early 90s. And because the Keys are so special, I've always believed there is no greater planning challenge in the country than in the Florida Keys. County planners for the various cities over the decades, those planners who've worked for the state, these are incredibly difficult high-level planning challenges. And I think we would be facing much tougher challenges and having much worse problems right now, if not for some of the really excellent, talented planners who've worked in the local governments down there for many years. Obviously, more needs to be done. There are just realities that have to be dealt with. But I really did want to make that point that these are not issues that are easily dealt with. And some of the best things we've been able to do have been, initiatives or work done by local planners that we've been able to translate into success. So I think it's important for us all to recognize that there are some really excellent people working in these local governments in the Keys. They deserve our support, they deserve our input, and they deserve our very strong nudging when we think that's appropriate too. All right, give me a void there and I'll fill it by blathering, but do you have any more questions out there?
Hello, Richard.
Hi.
Hi, this is Debbie Harrison Rumberger. How are you? I
Speaking-
remember,
Good.
you started working on the Keys in 1985. You're fooling yourself. I have a number of things to say. First of all, thank God for Richard Grosso, or we wouldn't have the Florida Keys. One of the things that I think is important for people to remember is that when we did much of the testimony on the original ROGO, we asked Max Mayfield, who was the guru of the National Weather Service, to come and present to us. And he said that the only way that they could increase hurricane evacuation participation was to go door to door asking residents if they planned to evacuate. And if they said no, they asked for body bag sizes. I know in the most recent hurricane in the Florida Keys in 2017, there were many, many people who didn't think that they would evacuate. And then at the last minute, they did want to evacuate, and that became very precarious. So that's a concern that I have, is that we need to be able to assure, when we're talking about requiring people to evacuate early, I don't know that there's a legal mechanism that we have or a police mechanism we have to be able to redo that, to assume that. But I'm very concerned about using that as a caliber. The other thing that I would say is that we also found out in the 1990s from the Department of Community Affairs that 80% of the cost of new development was borne by existing residents. I would love to see the Department of Commerce do another assessment of that, but I don't believe that that has changed much, because our impact fees do not come even close to what the cost of servicing those homes would be. I would also say that when it comes to sea level rise, there's been reviews that have been required by local governments to assess the sea level rise expectations by 2100. And the consultants came back and said that the only things that would be above water in 2100 are the lighthouses. And I'm wondering if we can find that consultant's report and be able to use that, because I think that what we're doing in the Keys by continuing to allow development is putting people at risk, not just from the inability to evacuate from hurricanes, but also a very, very bad investment that's going to cost not just property owners, but the local governments and probably the state government in terms of retreat and how we handle that. And the last thing I want to say is, when we began this endeavor, we had great governors. We had state and local representatives that fought to protect the Florida Keys. And we have lost that. When we began with Rick Scott coming in and eliminating growth management altogether, passing out the 1,300 units that are not allowed, all those kinds of things. It is so critically important that as a people, we know who we are putting in office, because you may say, we want to save these units for the future, but there's absolutely nothing that says that the next local government will honor that. So I think it's really important that we decide how we're going to protect areas. And one of the things that Hank Morgenstern said back in 1984 at a City of Key West meeting was, to people who said, I want my grandchildren to live here, I would have liked my grandchildren to live there. But he said, you have sold your rights for your children to live to developers across the Keys. It is not a question of when we get the last environmentally important properties or the last safety issues that we can provide, that we end up seeing this argument that we have to provide for future generations. Not everybody needs a new house. We can buy built homes. It doesn't mean you can't live there, but it means that if you want to live in the Keys, one of the most special places
in the world, that you have to be cognizant of what your footprint is. So Richard, I love you. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
We have one more question here in Key West, and there are quite a few good questions on the Q&A still. I think for time's sake, what we will try to do is communicate with those folks another way.
Hi, Richard. My name is Carl, and I have what I hope will be two relatively quick questions for you regarding affordable housing. And the first one is, for affordable housing which is built under affordable ROGO allocations, does the Monroe County have any type of penalties set up for property owners who rent out by either charging too much for the property beyond what was authorized according to the rules and regulations, or does it have penalties for charging to people who make too much to qualify as affordable tenants? And the other question is, in the event of a major hurricane where historically property values have depreciated, is there any type of funding available where the government could go out and buy houses where people wish to sell them rather than repair them, and then perhaps take those building allocations and reissue them as affordable housing allocations?
I believe the answer to your first set of questions is yes, but don't quote me. I have not looked at those rules in anything resembling a recent time to know exactly what they are in terms of penalties for not limiting your rents or your rentals to the affordable housing designations. I think it's yes, but I'm not sure myself. The second point is there are such programs in Florida, and in fact, it wasn't particularly robust, but I know that Monroe County has acquired some properties that fit that description, where parcels were bought out instead of allowing them to redevelop. You know, I think a lot of people would refer to those kinds of programs as managed retreat, where the government decides, hey, it's going to be cheaper to buy those, you know, repetitive damaged properties, repetitive loss properties, cheaper to buy them than to let them develop and have to rebuild them. So that's a thing. That's a program that many local governments have been instituted, including in the Keys, and it's probably one that that should be increased in terms of its use and application.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all for joining us here this evening. We'll do our best to capture any of the questions we didn't get to that are still in the Q&A and get some information out to you. If these quality of life issues matter to you, please join us at the Last Stand. We'll try to keep you posted about these and continue these conversations with our community. So thank you all, and good night.
Thanks, everyone.